All right, guys, let's get started. I'm sure people will filter in. We're actually very fortunate today to have a visiting professor, Dr. Matthew Ellman, who comes to us from the Yale School of Medicine. He is the director of their faculty practice clinic, and in his role as an educator, took on some years ago building the palliative care training at the medical school, which is interesting because he comes to us as a generalist who just took his passion and turned it into an educational adventure. He received his bachelor's degree in anthropology from Cornell and his MD from Harvard. He completed his primary care internal medicine residency at NYU Bellevue. We shared some stories of being old faculty when there was not much safety going on last night for dinner. Bob and Matt and I were telling these horrible stories, and poor Renee Claxton was like, oh my God, God, how did people live during those years?
You let them live.
Yeah, well, yeah, we didn't promise that they lived. Well, they must have lived. Anyway, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship in the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program at Yale, where he's been a long-term faculty member. As a core member of the clinical skills faculty team at Yale, he was charged with developing curriculum to teach palliative and end-of-life care skills to Yale medical students, which, as I said, really reflects his passion and his dedication to his patients. His passion and his goal is to ensure that all of the medical students under his care and beyond leave with the comfort and skills to effectively and compassionately care for patients with life-limiting illnesses. So we're delighted to have Matt here from Yale to talk to us a little bit about how he built a 4-year curriculum at the medical school in end-of-life care, which is really a pretty remarkable accomplishment given the number of things that have to be in a curriculum in medical school. So we'll let Matt tell us how we made this happen. Matt, you're up.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thanks so much to you, Dr. McNeil and Dr. Arnold, for inviting me here to speak. It's really an honor and a privilege, so thanks a lot. So yes, this has been my passion for quite a number of years, and delighted to be able to share some work we've done at Yale and kind of dialogue about ideas for improving this. So as Melissa mentioned, I'm a general internist, so by way of very brief explanation of how my passion in this area developed, I'd like to share just a little bit about my own background, starting with my internship at Bellevue. And I was an intern in 1987, and as many of you probably know, in the mid-'80s, Bellevue had really become the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic in New York City. Our medicine service, I really didn't know this when I chose to go to Bellevue, but our medicine service was dominated by AIDS patients. I'd say at least 50% of the patients on the medicine service were young, dying AIDS patients. Pretty mind-boggling considering what a different world it is today. But at that time, although certainly not as horrific for the doctors as for the patients, of course, but for newly minted house staff, it was really hard caring for so many young dying patients who we could do little for in terms of extending their lives. And I think a lot of us could distance ourselves from some of our patients because their lives in some cases seemed so different from our own, but that wasn't always the case. And just a very brief story, in July of my internship, I had a patient, some of these cases are very memorable for us, but a 30-year-old man who turned out to be really not very atypical in the long run, dying of AIDS with multi-drug-resistant TB and lymphoma, who was lying in bed with his mother and his sister at his bedside, very tachypnic, in pain, on a morphine drip. And his mother sort of pleaded with me as a kind of brand new intern, can you do something? He's suffering. And I really didn't learn anything in medical school, to be honest, about caring for the dying. So I went to my resident who said, well, He's already on a morphine drip. We really can't increase the dose because that'll hasten his death by depressing his respiration. So hopefully he'll pass away soon. And this, this happened repeatedly on our service, and I didn't have the education or the wherewithal to figure it out on my own at that time, how to really care for the patients near the end of life or imminently dying patients in that case. So it was tough. I would come home at nights thinking, I can't do this, but we plowed through. And fast forwarding 20 years in practice as a general internist, this is a photo of a notebook that I keep of personal patients of my own who have died over the years, over the past 20 years. And it's blurred so that the HIPAA police won't get us, but I don't think you can read the names. No. Okay. So I think there's probably about 250 patients on this list. I'm not a palliative care physician in my clinical practice, so that's really sort of a 20-year career in general internal medicine, probably pretty representative of someone who's practicing about 50% clinical time. I won't tell you what the denominator is, but it's I suppose like many internists, I'm a little bit OCD in my reaction when my patients don't do as well as I would have hoped. I figured out years ago that by sort of keeping this list, it was helpful for me to kind of look back, remember a name, a face, a conversation, maybe a visit, a home visit near the end of life. And it gave me the feeling that I was able to care for patients even when I couldn't cure or prolong their lives in very simplistic terms. And I just like to be reminded of these people. Sometimes it's something I want to remember that I could have done better, or something I did well that I may want to try to replicate again. I think over the years I realized that both with my sort of early experiences, lacking the training, recognizing, hearing from patients and their families how beneficial, how helpful it was to have me as an internist stay very involved in their care near the end of their lives, that's sort of where my passion to educate kind of the next generation of medical students came up, and we really were not doing a whole lot at Yale at that time. So that's by way of brief background. Today, learning objectives, hopefully to appreciate the importance of learning end-of-life care skills in a developmental fashion that's integrated over 4 years of medical school, to recognize how we can face barriers to implement this teaching, which are not trivial, and especially during the clinical years, which, as I'll talk about, I think is the most important time to do this teaching, and to consider strategies how we can improve implementation in programs across the spectrum. So 3 years ago, the IOM issued this evidence-based report, which some of you have probably seen, called Dying in America, Improving Quality and Honoring Individual Preferences Near the End of Life. And when it first was published, it did get some recognition in both the medical and the public press. As many of you know, these reports can be a little bit exhaustive, so I can summarize this one in 6 simple points. One is that in America, there are major gaps in end-of-life care for our patients. 2, there's a lot of misinformation and fear among the public, among certain parts of the healthcare system. Number 3 is that engaging patients and people has proved to be really hard, despite a lot of terrific work advancing the care of patients with terminal illness. 4, there are too few clinicians proficient in basic or primary palliative or end-of-life care, meaning there are certainly too few specialists in palliative care to serve the needs of our patients. But in addition, there are too few clinicians in many specialties who just have basic proficiency. 5 is no one really wants to talk about this, and I'm sure you've experienced that to some extent in your own practices. And 6, that improving end-of-life care really is achievable and should be a national priority. So regarding the 4th point, that there are too few clinicians in all specialties who are proficient in basic or primary palliative care. these competencies for all clinicians have been defined by a number of organizations. Many are evidence-based. For example, this slide shows a report by Schaefer et al. In Academic Medicine from about 4 years ago that defined competencies for medical students and residents in primary palliative care, and they're shown here in these five domains. So, for example, in the domain of communication, our medical students, upon graduating, should be able to explore a patient and family's understanding of illness, their concerns, goals, and values that inform the plan of care. So they may not be prepared to define a plan of care or lay that out, but they should be able to do that sort of inquiry to the exploration in order to get to that next point of a planning goal, a plan of care. And in the realm of pain and symptom management, our students should be able to be proficient in the management of pain. Of course, there's going to be patients with higher needs that will require specialist input, but all of our medical students should be able to, as it said here, do the basics with opioids, manipulate opioids in terms of equal analgesic dosing, and understand dependence and tolerance. And finally, the last example, in the area of palliative care principles and practice, our students should be able to define the philosophy and roles of palliative care and hospice across the life cycle, and to understand the difference between hospice and palliative care. And I believe these primary care competencies are relevant to all of us, both in our roles as clinicians and educators of students and residents and fellows. So how are we doing in undergraduate medical education in this area? How are we doing nationally? And certainly it's been promoted, and the LCME mandates that all medical schools have some palliative and end-of-life care curricula in their content. They don't specify exactly what that should be or how many hours and so forth. But we know from a lot of research that's been done that graduating students and house staff and practicing physicians really don't feel adequately prepared to provide this so-called basic palliative care and end-of-life care. So we looked back quite a 12, 13 years ago now, actually 14 years ago, when we were overhauling our clinical skills program at Yale. We wanted to see how we were doing specifically in this area of end-of-life and palliative care skills training. So we looked at our curriculum, we surveyed course directors, clerkship directors, and we created an in-depth survey of our own graduating class to better understand what experience they had had in medical school as they were leaving, their perspective as they were, off to their internships. And here's what we found. We found that 2/3 felt either not or only somewhat prepared to care for patients at the end of life. We found that nearly a half felt they had inadequate faculty guidance or support to help them cope with their emotional reactions when they had patients with life-limiting illness. And this, I thought, was pretty stunning at the time. About 40% of students said that they had cared for only 2 or few dying patients throughout all of medical school, which I think reflects just this notion that patients in the hospital, the students, perhaps the residents, the team, they didn't recognize these patients as really having end-of-life care needs, although clearly the hospital is filled with patients with very limited prognosis. And finally, they said that among the deaths that they did, patients that died that they were involved with, the majority of the deaths that they encountered at that time were failed resuscitations, and very few students reported they had sort of been observed or were involved in the care of patients who had a so-called natural death, not a failed code. So nationally, what's happening in UME in this area is I would characterize as pretty varied and uneven approaches, ranging from a single class, in the early years of medical school about death and dying, to institutions that have required palliative medicine rotations for all their medical students. very few do that. That's a challenge in terms of capacity for many services. And there are reports of some really, high quality educational interventions, with discrete components, workshops, and maybe different, one-day rotations. But there are very few longitudinal curricula that exist. And I would argue that these competencies are really too important to relegate to just a little bit of classroom time, or assuming that our students are going to get the exposure on the wards with the guidance at the time to learn these skills. And of course, is the effect of the hidden curriculum during rotations. So as we kind of thought through at that time, learning that our students really weren't getting what they needed, thought through, well, how do we improve this education at our school? We recognized that, we certainly need to take into account the hidden curriculum, meaning not what we teach them deliberately in lectures or didactics or workshops, but what they experience on the wards, the attitudes, the behavior of residents, attendings, the culture on the wards, which I think in this area of clinical care has certainly improved a lot over time, but historically has had a pretty negative impact on what students learn about palliative and end-of-life care. I mean, I've heard over the years a lot of students say they were discouraged from seeing patients with terminal illness. The attending would say, or the resident, that's just a CMO case, you're not going to learn anything from that, go see this patient instead. Or on the other end of the spectrum, where students were put in situations like breaking really life-changing news without the guidance or mentorship. So sort of these two ends of the spectrum that were really not ideal for education. So as we proceeded, we thought that it would be important to kind of have a vision of how to try to make this work. And I think I can summarize that by these points. One is that we thought there needed to be a developmental progression, that in the early years, focusing on observation, reflection, discussion, and then during the clinical years, much more active participation to really reinforce and advance the students' clinical skills. We thought it was essential to integrate a lot of the teaching into the clerkships, that, as you know, you can do a lot of stuff in the what used to be called the preclinical times. I guess it still is, but and then, a lot of it is lost if it's really not reinforced while students are caring for patients. We also felt that experiential learning and a lot of reflection was really important for students when in this area. That building resilience, having students, that these early experiences with terminally ill or dying patients can, in my view, can be really formative for students. That, if it's done right, it provides them with the skills, kind of a framework to stay present with patients as they go through their career. And finally, emphasizing cultural, spiritual, and interprofessional aspects of care, essential for complex patients with palliative care needs, but also neglected in a lot of part of at least our curriculum at the time. We used a lot of online learning and simulation, which I'll explain a little bit more in a minute. So that was kind of our overall approach, and this is an overview of what the curriculum looks like at this point through the 4 years. And I'm going to touch on, you can see that most of the, predominantly in the 3rd and 4th years when we do a lot of the teaching for the reasons I mentioned before. The entire curriculum is required of all students. It's not elective. The students have to participate in all components of this. After I tell you a little bit about the curriculum, I'll share with you some of the results of how we evaluated the curriculum. We used this mixed methods approach of analyzing student written reflections, looking at graduating surveys, and then demonstrating competency by creating an OSCE that students were required to do. So these are the components I want to tell you a little bit about here. The first is was one of the first pieces we put into place, and we put these in stepwise. We couldn't, sort of put the whole thing at once, but in a stepwise fashion over a few years. So the first piece is what we call an Introduction to End-of-Life Care workshop, and it basically has, very simple learning objectives that students recognize that they'll be caring for patients who die, that this happens in all specialties, and that we need them to achieve basic competency in this area. The second objective is that we want students to understand that there is a lot physicians can do for patients when they can't cure or prolong their lives, and that as medical students, as they start to care for patients, there's a lot that they can do as well. We felt that timing was really important for this workshop, and we placed it very early in the first year, actually within a few weeks of students starting medical school. And really that was to emphasize the point that learning these skills is just as important as the acquisition of scientific knowledge. And that was sort of the message that this is important, we're going to start early. So as I said, it takes place during the first few weeks of school. It has 4 simple components. We start with a reflection on prior experiences that they may have had in their families or their lives with death or dying. We have them write down a reflection. They then observe an interview of a terminally ill patient or a family member. We then have a panel discussion with clinicians from different specialties and upper class students, who they always love to have there. And then finally, a written reflection where the students write down what their impressions were from this workshop and what they want to remember from it as they start to care for patients. So as I said, we have, I think it's important to bring in clinicians from various specialties. For example, there's a pediatric cardiac surgeon who's participated for a number of years, and he tells the students, my job is to operate on newborn babies to correct congenital heart defects and save their lives. But he says that, actually, that's what I do most of the time. But he says, actually, the most important part of my job and the most meaningful part of my job is when I can't do that, when I have to sit with parents and carry them through this journey where their baby will not survive. So it's a very powerful message for students to hear, I think, from a whole range of different specialists. As I said, we have students reflect on what they heard over this, this few-hour workshop, and I'll share with you, and these reflections are very varied and wide-ranging, but I'll share with you kind of just to get a flavor of what the students experience. So this student wrote, I used to think of death as a big black box to be feared, not my own death per se, but the death of my future patients and the ones around me that I truly cared for. It was a topic that would keep me completely mute, at a loss of anything comforting to say. And when I hear these voices, these stories, I not only discover the wealth of empathy welled up inside me, brimming over my eyelids, but a strange relief, if you would. A refocusing that accepting the inevitability of death is actually an act of freedom, where now I can be there not to stop the terminal illness, but instead to generate meaningful conversation with the unfortunate soul and the ones around them. She got an A+. In the second year, we have an experience where all of our students go to a local hospice, either in an inpatient hospice for the day or on home hospice visits with a hospice nurse or physician. And again, pretty simple learning objectives. We want students to, these are second-year students, to define the key elements of a hospice assessment and compare this with an acute care assessment that they're learning in their doctor-patient training. And we want them to have the opportunity to discuss professional and personal challenges of caring for patients at the end of life with hospice clinicians. A former medical student of mine, Chung Sang Si, who's now a resident, finishing a residency at Mayo, was really interested at this at the time, and she created a module for her classmates, an online learning module called Terminal and Hospice Care, that students went through before they went to the actual hospice experience. And basically the module teaches these second-year students the 3 stages of active dying, common symptoms of the dying and how to treat them, what the treatment options are, and to understand the qualifications of what is hospice, how do you qualify, what are the provisions of hospice care. So all the students go through this learning module now, and then as I said, they accompany a hospice nurse or physician on visits to patients in groups of 2 to 4 students. They then debrief with that clinician, and then again they complete a written reflection on their experience. So this module that Chung Sang created is terrific, actually, and it's sort of open access now on the web. It takes about 30 to 45 minutes for students to go through. It has 3 cases. For an example, an 87-year-old woman of Asian descent who's dying of renal failure, which teaches them the 3 stages of active dying. It's very interactive. There are multiple choice questions throughout it. There's dialogue. What was really great is she put in these audio-visual clips that actually, a video that depicts Cheyne-Stokes breathing and an audio clip that depicts a so-called death rattle. So students sort of get this exposure before they go into the hospice and see patients. So as I mentioned, after they go through their hospice experience, we have them do a written reflection. And this includes a prompt asking them about their emotional reaction to the experience. And one of the reasons we did this is that, at least in the literature, there was no report of early preclinical students having a hospice experience. So we wanted to kind of understand what their reactions were to this. We had some apprehension about, although they all debriefed with a clinician afterward, about, reactions that might be distressing for students. So we looked at, we analyzed these reports, kind of did a thematic analysis, and you can see sort of the range of emotions that students reported. And what struck me, and I have some ideas, but I'm not sure exactly how to explain this, but even though, we asked these students specifically, please tell us about your emotional reactions to being with terminally ill patients or dying patients. And you can see on that top blue line that 26 out of these 85 students, about 30%, didn't write anything about an emotional reaction. A few of them, 5, specifically said, I had no emotional reaction to this experience, but the other 21 just sort of ignored it, didn't write about it, and it was a little puzzling, a little troubling. I think we thought about it and came up with some ideas, but don't really understand what that's about. And among the others, you can see this sort of a wide spectrum, as expected, about students' emotions, including, feeling sad, that it was difficult, it was heartening. Others said it was, they were moved or awed or surprised. So kind of the range that you might expect, depending on what they saw, because they all saw different things. And as I mentioned, all these students had the opportunity to debrief with their clinician after the experience. So the next piece I'll tell you about is in the 3rd year. And as I said, most of our effort has been in the 3rd year, the clinical years. And this is evaluating and communicating with a patient facing end of life on the wards. So these are the learning objectives for that. We want students to understand the elements of a comprehensive end of life care assessment, to apply these elements in an interview with a patient, to get more comfortable communicating about these issues with patients, and to appreciate the importance of reflection as they begin to care for patients near the end of life. So to prepare students for this assignment, we have a session. I meet with the whole class. We have about 110 students, and we have a good chunk of time to begin to talk about how to communicate with patients with serious illness. They've gone through all their patient-centered interviewing and training in terms of medical interviewing, but we focus in on what their role is going to be, that they will be taking care of patients near the end of life on the ward or patients facing serious illness, and what their role is going to be on the team for those patients, how they can communicate with these patients. We provide them with tools, written guides, little laminated cards just to kind of have, so they have something in their pocket. And we tell them that at some time during the third year, could be on medicine, surgery, whatever clerkship, you need to identify a patient who's facing end-of-life issues and complete this comprehensive assessment of the patient that includes all that you should think about: physical symptoms, psychological, spiritual sources of suffering. How is end-of-life care planning being addressed or not by your team? Talk to the nurses, the attending, the residents, the patient, most importantly. And then to write this up, to reflect on the experience, with prompts such as, how does it feel as a medical student to be with a patient who's near the end of life, to talk about these things with patients, what was challenging for you, what was surprising. So just prompts about reflecting on the experience. And then all the students meet in small groups, groups of 6 to 8 students with a faculty member, again from various clinical specialties, and present their case and their reflections. And specifically we say, tell us 1 or 2 things about end-of-life care that you learned that was interesting to share with your classmates. So again, I'll briefly share one reflection from a student. This is a woman who wrote, "I felt moved, saddened, and inspired by this patient and his experience. This exercise really allowed me to pause and feel and reflect on my feelings about this patient's impending death. I think so often in medicine we are rushed to move on to the next task, and we try to protect ourselves and our emotions by brushing things aside and focusing on our to-do lists. Nobody likes to talk about death, so we often avoid the subject even when it's staring us in the face. We are worried we'll say the wrong thing, that will upset the patient and family, that will upset ourselves, that will cry. And while it was challenging, I found comfort in knowing that my talking to them about their experience might in some small way have some therapeutic value. I learned to overcome my anxiety about talking about end-of-life issues with my patient." So that's really, not all the students get, this degree of reflection out of it, but that's really our hope, is that they'll sort of overcome some of the apprehension. And time again, I hear from students over the years that, they're apprehensive, and we coach them and explain that they're not there to give prognostic information or tell patients what to do, but really to open up a dialogue. And students, the 2 sort of themes that come out pretty frequently is that students were surprised that patients really want to talk about this, and that they just had to say, ask one question: what are you hoping for or worried about, given your condition now? And then the patient talked for an hour, and they hugged me, and they were happy. And the second thing that I've heard pretty frequently is that the students, having to do this exercise, said, what happened was I did this this assignment, and then I talked to my team and said, hey, is this patient appropriate to call the palliative care consult, or is this a patient appropriate for hospice? And it sometimes changed the course of care for the patient. So it was very empowering for students to recognize that their presence, it is required, but their willingness to kind of sit with patients and talk about it, could make a real difference. So that's very gratifying, I think, for the students. So moving on, in the third year, we also have 3 palliative care modules that include an online learning component and then a live workshop or seminar or patient experience. I don't have time to share all these with you, but I want to tell you a little bit about the second one, called Spiritual, Cultural, and Interprofessional Aspects of Palliative Care. And a little hokey, but I've got a brief video that kind of depicts this module. All right. The workshop we run is unique in two primary ways. One is that it's one of the few opportunities where medical students, nursing students, chaplains, social work trainees can learn together in an interprofessional way. The second reason it's unique is that it focuses primarily on the spiritual and cultural aspects of caring for patients with terminal illness or near the end of life. We have students coming from all different disciplines, different levels of training, and by going through this online module prior to the workshop, it lays the groundwork, it gets them all on the same page in order for them to begin to interact in the live workshop. We break the students up into small groups. The small group dynamic is interesting because the chaplains begin to be the educators in the group, and the medical students, nursing students recognize that they really have a lot to learn from the chaplains in terms of the care of the patient and how acknowledging and recognizing the spiritual aspects of the care of the patient really affects the whole management of the patient.
We felt that it would be important to speak to the patient alone unless she had explicitly stated in advance directives that she appoints her husband as her healthcare representative.
Is seeing the human being as a complete person, and that you will build these trusting relationships with these people that you serve and you encounter.
So what we've crafted here is really a simulation of a clinical team meeting where the students can take the lead role in devising a care plan for a patient facing terminal illness. So again, an emphasis on reflection. As students go through this online learning module, they are prompted to enter reflections about their case that they're seeing on the computer. And as the case progresses, these questions sort of come up, and then they're able to talk about these in the live workshop, as well as kind of form these interprofessional student groups to take on challenges of like a new paper palliative care case, and they can sort of experience the input from students in different professions and how that really enriches a plan of care. So towards the end of the fourth year, in our internship prep course, we have a number of advanced, so-called advanced communication skills training. And I don't have time to go over these, but I'm happy to share them with you. I will tell you about this palliative care OSCE that we created in just a moment. So as I mentioned, we used a mixed method evaluation. We analyzed these student written reflections and a lot of components of this to really understand how students were experiencing the learning. And one of these this is an analysis of the ward-based end-of-life care assignment, where students are told, find a patient on one of your clerkships that's facing end of life and go through this comprehensive assessment and reflect on it. And we analyzed 121 of these students' written reflections and found, as expected, a pretty rich and diverse response to the experience, which we could sort into these 6 themes that seem to show the impact of this exercise on the student. One was the recognition of the complexity of a patient's reaction to dying. The second was the sort of key importance of communication and how that plays out with patients in the hospital who are near the end of life. As I mentioned, the value of the clinician's presence, that was something that was a recurring theme that students were surprised by, that just their presence, their willingness to be with patients had a huge impact. Interpersonal dynamics, the range of their own personal reflections, and finally their perception of the assignment itself. Next, we looked at graduating student surveys, both our own, which I mentioned we did when we first started this curriculum, and the AAMCs. And in terms of our own in-depth survey, our homegrown survey regarding students' end-of-life experiences in education, this table shows a comparison of students who graduated in 2004 to 2007, before a lot of the curriculum was in place, compared with students graduating in 2011 when most of the students experienced a majority of the curriculum. And we found, in all these different domains of palliative and end-of-life care, that at least according to their perception and self-reported preparedness, that there was improvement in each area on this Likert scale ranging from 1 to 5. Next, we looked at the AAMC graduating survey. So as many of you know, the AAMC sends a survey out to every graduating medical student in the United States. And there were 2 questions that were relevant for our purposes. One was students' perception of their education in end-of-life care during medical school. And the second was their perception of their education in palliative care and pain management. And over the time period that we implemented this curriculum, we found increases in the proportion of students who said their education and training was appropriate, shown in the orange line, and decreases in the number of students or the percentage that felt that their education in these areas was inappropriate or insufficient. The bottom line here is interesting. This gray line is students who reported that their education in these areas was excessive. And actually that did go up a little bit over the years. You can't really see it on the graph too well. But I felt like that was okay. Better to have a little bit excessive than not enough. Too bad for them. And finally, we created a palliative care OSCE to really kind of look at students' performance in some of these skills. And this OSCE was designed to be both a formative and an assessment exercise. We used a simulated patient, a representative case of a patient with advanced cancer who knew that he or she had no further chemotherapy options. So it wasn't sort of a goals of care discussion or a giving bad news discussion. The student's task was to take a good palliative care history from a patient who's been told there are no more cancer treatments available for her. And they were asked to evaluate the patient from a biopsychosocial perspective and to determine the important aspects to help create a plan of care for the patient. They were told they didn't need to do a physical exam, it was just an interview. And we created a checklist of 14 history items in these 3 core palliative care domains that we felt students should know to inquire or have on their radar screen when they're interviewing a patient such as the one described. So we integrated this OSCE into a required 7-station OSCE for our fourth-year medical students. The other cases were chest pain, abdominal pain, a kid with a otitis, and this was, the 8th required case for them to do. And in the pilot year, we ran 94 students through this, and then we tweaked the case a bit to improve it, and then the implementation year, 95 students. And overall, they did pretty well. They scored a mean score of 75% on this history checklist that I just described, which was really comparable to, how they performed in a case of chest pain or abdominal pain. So we felt that they, there's no sort of obvious gold standard of what it should be, but it seemed to be in line with other performances. We also looked at the psychometrics properties of this OSCE, and it seemed to be, pretty good. Not perfect, but it performed pretty well. What we didn't do, which I think somebody asked me at another talk I gave, is, well, did you have students write down, what their care plan might be after this interview, which would have been interesting to see, but we didn't have time to do that in this OSCE. So overall, I'd say in terms of our kind of view of the overall evaluation, we felt we demonstrated effectiveness of some individual components. We at least improved the students' perception of the adequacy of their instruction in these areas and their self-reported preparedness in this area. And we felt we demonstrated, pretty decent competency in primary palliative care communication skills. So reflecting on some of the strategies that I think turned out to be helpful, were important, was one, since there are activities, learning activities that take place over 4 years, it's not like one block or one classroom. We created a website to kind of house all this, to keep student, so they'd have a place to go. It's like, oh, now I'm doing my palliative and end-of-life care activity in the 3rd year. So we created a website that sort of housed all the faculty resources, the online modules, and so forth. This is the face page for this website, and this is where students can go to access these modules and see what's coming up next. And it's open access, so a number of students from other schools use it as well. Another thing that we thought was effective was blending these online modules with live workshops. And I think that was really helpful in terms of integrating the activities onto the clerkships, because students could sort of do some of the learning, on their own time, and then benefit from that flipped classroom experience and really use the live time that we had with them effectively. And also it really helped with the interprofessional learning, because that logistically is a big challenge in terms of getting nursing students, divinity students, and kind of getting them on the same page. So it was helpful to have all these students go through the same module and then get together. And finally, I think it was really helpful to use faculty from many clinical specialties and faculty from many professions, because this type of learning, skills learning, you really need to do in small groups, certainly. And there just aren't, at least at Yale, there certainly are not enough specific faculty in the palliative medicine department to handle all this. And I think particularly for UME education in this area, it's important for students to see that faculty in surgery, in OBGYN, and pediatrics, that there are models for this basic learning in all specialties. In terms of faculty participation, as I said, we now have about 40 to 50 faculty educators that each devote about, depending on what part of the curriculum they participate, anywhere from 3 to 12 hours a year. So not a huge input. Of course, they don't get paid or any recognition, but they seem to come back. So they seem to like doing it. And in fact, some of them say, this is my favorite teaching that I do. So it's also great because it's an opportunity for me and them to interact with faculty in other specialties, which doesn't happen too often. So here's the current list of faculty that are involved, and you can see they sort of hail from all specialties, all different professions as well. And for some of the non-physicians faculty, it's really one of the first acknowledgement of their integral role in teaching medical students and other students, which has been really gratifying for me. Institutional support, I think there's definitely some support that's needed. I think it's relatively modest in the scheme of things. I think the faculty champion in this effort has been me, and I love doing it. And I love devoting the time, and I have been given some support to do this by the school. Administrative support is, particularly when you're coordinating different schools, different nursing school, divinity, social work, you definitely, that can be hard. You need some good administrative support, in my experience. And finally, a lot of the faculty, as I said, are really delighted to teach in this, and it's not a struggle to get them. Just a few final reflections. As I said, institutional support, I always point out to kind of the powers that be above me that this is required by the LCME, and we need to do it, and we need to do it well. Sometimes that has some effect. Faculty capacity, I've mentioned. I try to have an annual dinner every year to bring all these faculty together, so there's a sense of community and participating in this. Time in the curriculum, we all struggle to kind of fight for our piece of time in busy curriculum. I was fortunate when I started this to have somebody, leading the curriculum change that felt strongly that this was important to improve at our school. The clerkship directors I found that they're happy to have this, and as long as they don't have to do anything, they're like delighted to have this happen on their clerkship. They can say we're doing this, and I have to kind of remind them every year, and so they, when their introduction to the start of their clerkships, they remind students this is a great clerkship to kind of do some of your palliative and end-of-life care learning. We've struggled, I'd say the two areas that we've continue to struggle with is outside sites like hospices. You need a lot of capacity because students can only go in groups of 2 or 3 to visit a hospice patient. So that's something that continues to be a struggle that we kind of have to make happen every year. And then finally, it took about 5 or 6 years to really get that interprofessional piece going. And Yale doesn't have a social work school. We need social workers to participate, students to participate in this to really make it real. So we've gone outside to other colleges in Connecticut to find social work students, and now we've got them coming regularly. But it's, logistically, that part's not easy. So a few closing special thanks for people that have supported me and partnered with me in all these endeavors, and for which I'm very grateful. And thank you. I'd like to close with a quote that I really like from Henri Nouwen, who said, "Anyone who willingly enters into the pain of a stranger," which is something we all do as clinicians, is truly a remarkable person. So thank you, and I'd be delighted to hear any comments or questions.
It's a nice talk.
Thank you.
When you get students to go out to hospice and they're going in groups of 2 or 3, do you struggle to actually get them engaged in that interaction? Because I could see that there'd be some students that are sort of passive about the whole process, and how do you make it so that they really have a task and that they have to do something and have an interaction with the patient? Because what I've found when I've tried to encourage students at the bedside to have these interactions is they're willing to watch me have an end-of-life conversation.
Yes.
But they're really reluctant to do it themselves, even when it's sort of teed up, like, this is a patient that's dying really soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you get them to actually engage?
That's a great question. I think the hospice experience is for second-year students in the fall. So, they really have not had a ton of clinical experience. And as far as from what I understand, talking to students, reading their reflections, they engage, some certainly much more than others. Some really, it's clear they really kept their distance. And I think developmentally, I think the goal of that is really not so much that they're really in there talking to the patient, but for me is that they step foot in a hospice and understand what a hospice is, that they actually see a patient in hospice care. Because I have a lot of colleagues that have never been in a hospice. A lot of residents have never been in a hospice, and I think I hear from students that just having gone there, they, it's in their brain. They remember, this is how somebody can, different than the dying patient in the hospital. So just to have that simple experience. And the second is that it's much more of an observation at that point. They're early second-year students, so we don't really expect them. Some of them do, but we don't really expect them to engage that much at that point. So we really just want them to understand what hospice is, to see a hospice clinician and observe. on the wards, when we have them really like, now it's your turn, you have to get in there. You know, there's a, like I said, I meet with the whole class, there's a lot of prep, but in the end, some students are, you know, take to it more than others, I think. I think the fact that it's required, at least they have to try something and think about what they've done and write about it and talk about it with their classmates. So, you know, it ups the ante a little bit having this as a required assignment. Yes?
Have you had a chance to either anecdotally or formally talk with the patients who are on the other side of this curriculum and how amenable they are, or whether they think that the activities or interface with the students is therapeutic?
That's a great question, and the short answer is no, and I probably should have in some fashion. The idea is that, you know, students, that they're not, you know, sort of searching around the wards for a dying patient to do their assignment, and certainly the students say that to me. They're like, you know, why are you asking me to put a patient through this just so I can learn something? That is so cruel or unfair. And, you know, it's really, the assignment is while you're caring for a patient on medicine, you know, you're part of the team, that's one of your 2 or 3 patients that you're following, you know, is this, you should be doing this anyway, or the team should be, and you should be, you know, so it's really supposed to be integrated into, they're talking to this patient, they're doing rounds on this patient daily. This is just giving them a framework of, hey, if you're not thinking about this in addition to, you know, all the acute care, think about it, and in very non-threatening ways, in open-ended ways, ask the patient, you know, how are you doing? What are you hoping for at this point? What have the doctors told you about your condition and what the treatment options are? So I think you're right that would be great to actually have the resources to at least take a sample of patients to find out. But anecdotally, what I hear, at least from the students, is that, you know, they're constantly surprised about how much the patients appreciate it. But I'm sure that's not always the case. Yes?
So one of the things that struck me, other than really building an incredibly thoughtful 4-year curriculum, is how scholarly you were
Mm-hmm.
in your approach to evaluating the curriculum, which I think is something sort of all of us in academic medicine strive for. And I don't know if you have any thoughts to share about how you made that happen, because it's
Mhm.
just elegant to watch your curriculum, here's the evaluation, here's what was published.
Mm-hmm.
The next iteration, here's how we evaluated, here's how it was published.
Yeah, I milked it big time.
I would say you were thoughtful and productive.
Yeah,
but that's
thank you.
first thinking ahead.
Yeah, it did involve thinking ahead, and, you know, a lot of this is, you know, this is not like NIH grant type research. I mean, this you can do on the stuff we really did on it. Didn't really cost anything except time, right? In terms of, you know, the time to, you know, think about thoughtfully about a robust survey and do it in the appropriate way. Analyzing student written reflections, you know, very, very time consuming, but doesn't really cost anything. So I think I had,
IRB for all of these?
yes, IRB for all of
And
them.
the students had to opt in?
Well, I would say there were 2 categories. One where there were IRBs where we had to get the students to opt in.
Like the written reflections and the analysis.
Yeah, and other parts, you know, really didn't require IRB legitimately because they were part of just ongoing curriculum evaluation and improvement. And I think a lot of it actually fell into that category. The OSCE was IRB'd because we couldn't really justify that, yeah. But, you know, it was all anonymous. We didn't, you know, and that was clear. So I think, yeah, I mean, when I set out to do it, I really felt that it was important to do it in a scholarly way in order to be able to publish, to disseminate, to hopefully, you know, help other programs that were interested in this. to advance it. So,
Who's out?
and I love doing the writing and stuff. Yeah.
All right, we're at the 9 o'clock hour, so we'll thank Nat.
Thank you. Thanks so much.